Before we begin, I must share an important disclaimer. The story you are about to hear is a true crime documentary pieced together from various historical sources, court documents, police records, and first-hand accounts. The purpose of presenting this narrative is solely to deliver the correct information to you, the viewer. Our aim is to shed light on a story often lost in Hollywood myth, to understand a life erased by power. If you are new here, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. We dedicate ourselves to uncovering the real stories behind the legends, stories that demand to be heard with clarity and respect for the truth. Now, prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows of organized crime, into a world where a single moment of disrespect could end a life, and where a young man named Michael became forever known as Spider. In the dim, smoke-filled back rooms of Robert's Lounge in Queens, New York, during the late 1960s and early 1970s, the air was thick with more than just cigar smoke and the scent of cheap whiskey. It was saturated with a palpable, suffocating fear, a currency more valuable than the cash-changing hands in illicit card games. This was the world, not of glamorous gangsters, but of a brutal, petty, and paranoid hierarchy presided over by men like Jimmy Burke and his volatile protege, Tommy DeSimone. And into this world, not by choice but by necessity, walked a young man named Michael Gianco. To understand his fate, we must first erase the Hollywood gloss. Michael was not Spider in the sense of a cunning web weaver. The nickname, likely born from his lean frame and quick, perhaps nervous movements, was a label placed upon him in a universe where everyone had a moniker that stripped them of their humanity. He was a bar worker, a kid from the neighborhood trying to scrape together a living in one of the few economies available to him, the service economy of the mob. His job was to fetch drinks, clean ashtrays, run errands, and remain invisible. Survival in this ecosystem depended on a simple, unwritten code. You kept your head down, your mouth shut, and you never ever challenged the fragile egos of the men who owned the room. These men were not the sophisticated dons of fiction. They were vicious, insecure, and perpetually on edge, their status enforced through sudden, explosive violence. Michael Gianco existed on the lowest rung of this ladder. He was what the mafia termed a civilian, but one whose life was entirely circumscribed by their rules. His paycheck, his safety, his very sense of reality depended on the moods of men like Tommy. Tommy DeSimone was a particular kind of monster, a man whose reputation for brutality was matched only by his desperate, clawing need to be respected as a serious gangster, a made man. He was perpetually performing, an actor in his own violent drama, and the bar help, the waitresses, the errand boys, they were his captive audience. Every interaction was a test of his dominance. For Michael, a typical shift was a high-wire act performed in the dark. A spilled drink, a delayed response, a glance misinterpreted. Any minor slip could be catastrophically reframed as an act of disrespect. This was the psychological prison of mob-controlled spaces. It wasn't just about avoiding illegal acts, it was about the relentless, exhausting performance of subservience. You had to laugh at the right time, disappear at the right moment, and absorb abuse without a flicker of reaction. Your personhood was willingly surrendered at the door in exchange for the privilege of earning a wage. Michael, like countless other young men in neighborhoods across New York, was trapped in this gray zone. He wasn't part of the crew, but he was irrevocably of their world. He heard the plans, saw the faces, knew the codes. This knowledge did not empower him, it made him a liability. His life was a testament to a grim economic truth. When legitimate opportunities are scarce, the shadow economy becomes the only employer, and it pays in both cash and constant terror. The bar itself, Robert's Lounge, was a character in this story. It was not a vibrant social hub, but a fortified bunker for criminals. The laughter was too loud, the jokes too sharp, the silences too heavy. It was a place where conversations died when certain people entered, where eyes were carefully averted from certain tables. For Michael, navigating the floor was a daily exercise in situational awareness. He had to map the room not for customers needing refills, but for shifting moods and potential triggers. He served drinks to men who, hours earlier, might have been beating a debtor senseless in a storage room. He cleaned up. After meetings that planned armed robberies, the normalcy of his tasks, wiping a counter, stacking glasses, contrasted grotesquely with the abnormal, violent reality of the environment. This dissonance was the backdrop of his life. He was a civilian living in a military occupation, where the occupying army wore suits and laughed at jokes he didn't dare understand. His dream, if he allowed himself one, was likely simple: to get through the night, to get paid, and to get home without incident. The larger ambitions of the mobsters, the scores, the glory, the notoriety, were not his. His ambition was survival. Yet, in a system designed to consume the expendable, mere survival is often the most audacious and dangerous goal of all. His very presence was a reminder of the line between them and us, a line the gangsters needed to keep brutally clear. Michael Spider Gianco, therefore, was more than a future victim. He was a living symbol of the ecosystem's bottom tier. His story begins not with a crime he committed, but with the crime of his circumstance. He was born into a geography of limited options, where the local power structure was criminal, and serving it was the most visible form of employment. To label him an innocent bystander would be to misunderstand the mechanics of such a world. There are no bystanders, there are only participants, willing or not. Every time he handed Tommy DeSimone a glass, he was participating, reinforcing the hierarchy that would ultimately kill him. This is the insidious nature of such systems. They force complicity as the price of daily bread. So, as we picture him moving through the haze of Robert's Lounge, we must see not a footnote to a gangster's legend, but a young man already caught in a narrative far larger and more cruel than he could comprehend. His life was a slow-motion lesson in the cost of proximity to power without any of its protections. He was close enough to feel its heat, but destined only to be burned by it. The incident that would permanently weave Michael Gianco's name into the dark tapestry of mafia lore was not a planned hit, a betrayal of omerta, or a failed robbery. It was, by all credible accounts, a spontaneous eruption of psychotic rage during a mundane late-night card game. A flash of violence so disproportionate and absurd it lays bare the terrifying randomness of life under mob rule. The popular cinematic version, immortalized in Goodfellas, shows a young Spider being shot for complaining about being asked to get drinks. While the core truth, a murder over a perceived slight, remains, the reality was even more chilling in its petty brutality. On that fateful night, Michael was doing his job, circulating among the tables of gamblers, many of whom were deep in their cups and deeper into debt. The atmosphere was typically tense, a low hum of aggression barely masked by the clatter of chips and ice cubes. Tommy DeSimone was at a table, losing. For a man like Tommy, whose entire self-worth was tied to an image of imposing, untouchable strength, losing at cards in front of an audience was an intolerable affront. His mood, always a volatile cocktail of insecurity and fury, was darkening by the minute. He needed a target, a vessel for his humiliation. Michael, serving drinks, became that target. The exact exchange is lost to history, but it is understood that Tommy, in a fit of pique, ordered Michael to fetch yet another round. Perhaps Michael hesitated, perhaps he sighed, perhaps he simply moved too slowly for Tommy's liking. In the distorted logic of the gangster ego, this minute lapse was not poor service. It was a direct challenge, an insult, a declaration that Tommy was not being shown the fear and deference he demanded. It was the spark in the powder keg. Witnesses described what happened next as a sudden, shocking blur. Tommy, without warning, drew a pistol and fired at Michael Gianco. The bullet struck the young man, who collapsed to the filthy floor of the bar. This was not the clean, cinematic death of movies. It was messy, painful, and chaotic. In that moment, Michael was not a person, he was an object lesson. Tommy had instantly reasserted his dominance, transforming his gambling loss into a demonstration of his ultimate power, the power of life and death over the most vulnerable person in the room. The message was received by everyone present, but the story and the deeper horror did not end there. Michael Gianco, miraculously, did not die. He was rushed to the hospital, survived surgery, and began a long, painful recovery. This survival created a profound and dangerous problem. In the twisted code of the streets, and particularly in the neurotic world of the mafia, allowing someone you tried to kill to live was a sign of weakness. It created a living witness, a walking reminder of a failed act of violence. For Tommy, a man consumed by his reputation, Michael's survival was an ongoing humiliation. It was a scratch on the glossy veneer of his terror. Furthermore, Michael now possessed a dangerous piece of knowledge. He knew, firsthand and without ambiguity, that Tommy DeSimone was capable of killing him over nothing. This knowledge fundamentally altered their relationship. Could Michael ever look at Tommy again without fear, or worse, without a flicker of accusation? For the system to maintain its grip, such knowledge could not be allowed to persist. The unwritten law demanded that the lesson be completed. During his convalescence, Michael faced an impossible choice, a choice that defines the trap of the mob-controlled world. He could not go to the police. That was unthinkable. A death sentence for him and possibly his family, and a violation of the neighborhood's corrosive silence. Yet, returning to work at Robert's Lounge was a return to the lion's den. His family reportedly urged him to leave the city, to start over somewhere far away. But for a young man with limited means, deep local ties, and perhaps a stubborn sense of normalcy, or even a misplaced belief in the basic rules of humanity, leaving everything he knew was a monumental, terrifying prospect. The bar was his job, his community, his entire economic reality. The system, in its perverse genius, made staying seem like the only viable option. It relied on this very inertia, this fear of the unknown, to keep its victims in place. So, against what any outside observer would scream was better judgment, Michael Gianco, once healed, walked back through the doors of Robert's lounge. It was the decision that sealed his fate. His return was interpreted not as resilience, but as an act of incredible arrogance, a silent challenge. In Tommy's paranoid mind, and in the calculus of the mob hierarchy that tolerated Tommy's insanity because he was a prolific earner, Michael's presence became untenable. He was now a permanent stain on Tommy's ego, a living testament to an act of violence that lacked the finality required to command respect. His every step, his every served drink, was a quiet rebellion. The system had shown him its ultimate violence, and he had, by virtue of surviving and returning, called its bluff. That bluff could not stand. The stage was now set for the final, tragic act. Michael's return was the true death sentence, not the initial shooting. The first bullet was a crime of passion. What would follow would be a cold, deliberate execution, an administrative cleaning of a loose end. The boy who came back to work was already a ghost, his fate decided by the very mechanics of the world he sought to re-enter. He had, in the most tragic possible, broken the cardinal rule. He had made himself a problem, and in this world, problems were not solved. They were erased. The final act of Michael Gianco's short life was not a grand confrontation, but a sordid, calculated piece of administrative evil. His return to Robert's lounge had made him a marked man, a walking complication in the otherwise seamless narrative of fear that Tommy DeSimone and his kind relied upon to govern their small, violent kingdom. The decision to eliminate him would not have been a dramatic sit-down meeting. More likely, it was a muttered understanding between Tommy and his mentor, Jimmy Burke, a man who valued efficiency and the elimination of liabilities above all else. Michael's continued existence was now a liability. He was a witness who had seen the mask slip, a civilian who had felt the gangster's ultimate wrath, and lived to tell the tale, if only to himself. In the perverted logic of their world, he had to be silenced permanently to validate the initial act of violence and to restore the pristine, terrifying clarity of Tommy's power. The date was December 23, 1970. The setting, again, was Robert's lounge, the only workplace Michael had ever known in this life, now transformed into his execution chamber. The Christmas season's forced cheer and twinkling lights outside offered a grotesque contrast to the darkness gathering within the bar. Michael was going about his duties, perhaps hoping that the routine would eventually absorb the tension, that time would sand down the sharp edges of memory. He was wrong. Tommy DeSimone, along with another associate, lured Michael from the main bar area under a pretext. It might have been a request to help with a crate in the back, to fetch a special bottle from the basement storage, or to settle a trivial matter, the classic chilling ruse of normalcy that precedes murder. Michael Conditi, warned to obey, followed. He was led to the basement, a space of concrete, dust, and shadows, far from the muffled sounds of the bar above. This was where the real business of the mafia often transpired, the counting of illicit money, the hiding of weapons, the settling of scores. It was a perfect trap. There would be no witnesses here except the willing. There would be no chance of survival, no miraculous recovery. What followed was an act of pure, unrestrained savagery that stands as a stark repudiation of any romantic notion of honor among thieves. Tommy DeSimone did not simply shoot Michael Gianco. He engaged in an overkill of such horrific proportion that its only possible purpose was catharsis for his own rage and a deliberate act of erasure. Reports and subsequent investigations indicate that Tommy fired multiple shots from a pistol into the young man, but he did not stop. He then produced a machete and hacked at the body. The violence was frenzied, excessive, and deeply personal. This was not a clinical hit, it was a tantrum of annihilation. Tommy wasn't just killing a nuisance, he was trying to obliterate the very idea of Michael Gianco, to physically tear apart the living proof of his own impotence. Every slash was an attempt to cut away his own humiliation. When the horrific act was complete, the cleanup began, the true hallmark of organized crime. The body was disposed of with the cold efficiency of garbage removal. Michael Gianco was stuffed into a 55-gallon oil drum, which was then filled with cement. This metal coffin was loaded into a truck and driven to a vacant lot in New Jersey, where it was buried, hidden from the world, meant to disappear forever. The entire process, the luring, the murder, the dismemberment, the encasement in concrete, was a ritual of dehumanization. Michael was transformed from a person into a problem, then into a corpse, and into mere inconvenient waste to be contained and buried. His disappearance was not a mystery to the inner circle. It was an open secret, a lesson reinforced. The message was clear and received by every bar worker, every hanger-on, every aspiring gangster, this is the cost of stepping out of your place, even if you were forced out of it by our own violence. Your life is so insignificant that it can be ended in a fit of pique, and your body can be made to vanish as if you never existed. The silence that followed was not the silence of mystery, but the silence of complicity and terror. For years, Michael Gianco was simply gone. His family knew he was missing, but in that neighborhood, asking too many questions was itself a dangerous act. The police had no body, no witnesses willing to speak, and little impetus to challenge the powerful currents of organized crime in Queens. The case grew cold, another nameless entry in a file of missing persons from a world that regularly consumed its own. Michael had been erased twice, first physically, then from memory. His story only began to resurface years later, not through police work, but through the fracturing of the very code that had sealed his fate. When men like Henry Hill, facing decades in prison, broke omerta and became federal witnesses, they brought these buried secrets into the light of day. The concrete-filled drum was eventually located, a grim archaeological find from a war waged in basements and bars. The testimony of mob turncoats provided the narrative to go with the bones. But even in revelation, the truth was distorted, absorbed into the legend of the gangsters themselves. Michael's death became a footnote in the story of Tommy DeSimone's craziness, a colorful anecdote in the saga of the Lufthansa heist crew. His humanity was buried a second time, under layers of myth and movie magic. The raw, terrifying truth that a young man was tortured and dismembered for the crime of surviving a first attempt on his life was too bleak, too meaningless for a satisfying gangster tale. It was not a rise and fall, it was simply a fall, a crushing by a machine that didn't even notice his name as it ground him into dust. The story of Michael Spider. Gianco does not end with the discovery of his remains or the cinematic retelling of his murder. To end there would be to accept the gangster narrative, to allow his death to serve as mere exposition for the brutality of Tommy DeSimone. The true ending of this story lies in the silent aftermath, in the questions that hang in the air long after the guns and machetes are still. It lies in understanding what his erased life and grotesque death tell us about the nature of power, fear, and the systems we tolerate. Michael's fate was not an anomaly, it was the guaranteed product of a closed system designed to protect itself at all costs. Tommy DeSimone, for all his psychotic fury, was not the root cause, he was merely the most volatile instrument. The real culprit was the ecosystem that empowered him, that provided him with a pool of expendable young men like Michael, and that enforced the silence that allowed the murder to be both committed and concealed. Jimmy Burke, the calculating mastermind behind Robert's Lounge, understood this. He understood that Tommy's violence, while messy, served a purpose. It enforced discipline through random terror. By allowing Tommy to operate with impunity, Burke maintained a climate where absolute obedience was the only law. Michael's death was a cost of doing business, a necessary piece of maintenance to keep the machinery of fear well-oiled. Every person who knew what happened and said nothing, whether out of fear, complicity, or a warped sense of loyalty, became a cog in that same machine. The system's greatest triumph was not the murder itself, but the decades of silence that followed, a silence so profound it nearly succeeded in deleting a human being from history. This is the core of the story that Hollywood could never truly capture, the banality of the evil that consumed Michael Gianco. There was no epic rivalry, no betrayal of a cred code. There was a petty man with a fragile ego, a vulnerable boy in the wrong place, and a social and economic structure that made the boy's annihilation not just possible, but inevitable. Michael's tragedy is the tragedy of the invisible collateral damage in all criminal empires. He represents the countless nameless individuals whose lives are bent, broken, or ended not for crossing the mob, but simply for existing within its orbit. They are the waitresses, the bartenders, the drivers, the neighbors who see too much, the family members who ask the wrong questions. Their stories are rarely told because they lack the glamorous arc of the gangster's rise and fall. They offer only a straightforward, unyielding lesson in despair. When we glamorize figures like Tommy DeSimone or Henry Hill, even in critique, we unconsciously participate in the same system of values that sacrificed Michael Gianco. We focus on the boldness of the heist, the sharpness of the suits, the dark charisma of the outlaw. We must therefore consciously refocus the lens onto the Spider Giancos of the world. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to be expendable? How do economic and social conditions create classes of people who are deemed acceptable losses? The mob did not invent this concept, it merely applied it in its rawest, most local form. Michael's life and death are a microcosm of how any unjust system operates. It identifies the vulnerable, exploits their labor, controls them through fear, and disposes of them without a ripple when they become inconvenient. The concrete that encased his body is the perfect metaphor for the weight of that system, forever trying to bury the evidence of its own cruelty. Today, Michael has no grave to visit, no lasting memorial. His legacy is a cautionary tale told in the dark corners of true crime lore, often stripped of its profound moral weight. To honor his memory is not to seek vengeance, but to insist on remembrance and understanding. It is to recognize that the true horror of organized crime is not the flashy violence, but the quiet, everyday terror it imposes on the innocent lives it touches. It is to acknowledge that for every charismatic gangster who becomes a movie character, there are 100 Michael Giancos, whose entire existence was reduced to a brutal lesson in a game they never asked to play. His story is an antidote to nostalgia. It is a demand that we look past the myth and see the human cost. It reminds us that in the economy of the underworld, the smallest currency is a human life, and it is spent with terrifying casualness. As we turn away from this story, we carry with us the image not of a gangster, but of a young man walking back into a bar, hoping for normalcy, walking into a basement from which he would never return. That image, and the silence that swallowed it for so long, is the most powerful indictment of that world possible. It asks us what we are willing to see, and who we are willing to remember, when the glitter of the legend finally fades to gray. If this unfiltered journey into a forgotten truth has resonated with you, if you believe these stories of the erased and the expendable deserve to be heard, then your engagement is crucial. Please honor the memory of the real lives behind the myths by subscribing to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's shadowed corners. We are committed to shifting the focus from the glamorized perpetrators to the human cost, one meticulously researched story at a time. Share this video with others who seek understanding beyond the Hollywood facade. Your viewership supports this mission to bring correct, respectful, and impactful narratives to light. Thank you for listening, for remembering, and for being a part of this community dedicated to truth.